The church bell tolled with a heavy finality, its echoes rolling across the quiet cemetery where dozens of cars lined the road. Inside the hall, the air was thick with grief and unspoken tension. The millionaire's mother, a woman known for her grace and unwavering presence in the community, lay in her casket surrounded by lilies and roses. Guests dressed in stark black filed in, their eyes lowered, some dabbing their faces with tissues while others whispered in hushed tones that carried more curiosity than condolence. Every seat was filled, and yet, the silence that lingered over the room felt louder than the organ's slow, sorrowful hymn. All eyes drifted toward the front row, where the family sat fractured in their grief. The son, a man whose wealth had made headlines more often than his personal life, sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, trying to keep his emotions buried beneath a polished exterior. Beside him, a seat remained empty, a symbolic gap that represented more than absence. It represented betrayal, broken vows, and the chaos of a family divided. Then she entered, the divorced wife, her presence like a shadow slipping into the sacred space. Her face carried a quiet determination, her hand resting protectively over the curve of her stomach, the pregnancy impossible to ignore under her dark, fitted dress. Murmurs rippled instantly through the rows as heads turned, the whispers gaining volume with each passing second. "She came here. Now?" someone muttered under their breath, while another leaned closer to ask, "Is she really pregnant?" The son's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and unwelcoming, but also filled with something deeper, conflict, perhaps even regret. The elderly father, sitting at the very end of the row, leaned heavily on his cane. His hands trembled as he tried to steady himself, his face pale not just with grief but with the weight of years and burdens carried in silence. He stared at the sight of his former daughter-in-law, his eyes widening with disbelief. His wife's funeral was supposed to be a moment of solemnity, a final farewell, and yet the air seemed poisoned with scandal. Around them, extended relatives shifted uneasily, some exchanging knowing glances, others staring openly as though waiting for a confrontation to ignite. No one spoke, but the atmosphere pulsed with an unspoken awareness that this day would not end as quietly as it began. Somewhere amid the prayers and the tears, a truth was waiting to surface, and when it did, it would shatter the fragile composure of the grieving family. And in the hands of the elderly father, a folded piece of paper, unopened but burning with secrets, waited to strike like lightning at the heart of them all. The story of the millionaire's family began long before the funeral, in a modest neighborhood where ambition was the only inheritance passed down. The son, now wealthy and widely recognized, was not born into luxury. His parents had worked tirelessly for decades, his mother keeping the household alive with frugality and warmth, while his father labored at a factory, later saving every penny to open a small shop that grew slowly into a respectable business. From these humble beginnings, the family instilled in their only child a determination to rise higher, to seek opportunities beyond what was handed to him. His mother, in particular, believed he was destined for greatness. She spoke often of sacrifice, urging him to study harder, think bigger, and never allow himself to be satisfied with mediocrity. It was her encouragement, paired with his relentless drive, that eventually propelled him into the world of investments, real estate, and high-risk ventures that turned into extraordinary success. Wealth, however, does not arrive quietly. By his 30s, the son was no longer just the pride of his family but also the subject of envy in the community. Magazines wrote about his rise, newspapers photographed his lavish parties, and whispers followed him wherever he went. He bought mansions, cars, and land. His signature could make or break a deal. For his parents, this ascent was both a blessing and a burden. The mother adored seeing her son celebrated, but she also worried about the growing arrogance in his eyes, the sharpness in his tone whenever she spoke of humility. The father, more traditional and less dazzled by fame, began to feel distanced from the son who rarely had time for simple dinners or quiet evenings anymore. Still, the mother became the anchor. She kept family traditions alive, organizing gatherings, reminding her son to give back, urging him to maintain ties with the community that had once supported them. She was a figure of grace, respected by neighbors for her kindness and admired by relatives for her strength. Her sudden illness, therefore, struck like a storm. Cancer, relentless and unyielding, drained her of life over the course of 2 years. Throughout her battle, she kept her dignity, never allowing visitors to see the depth of her suffering. The son, despite his resources, could not save her, and this helplessness weighed heavily on his pride. For a man who thought money could solve every problem, this was the first time he faced a wall too high to climb. The father, meanwhile, grew frilier in those years. Watching his lifelong partner fade broke him piece by piece. He had always leaned on her, even when he played the role of protector, and without her, he felt like a man standing on a crumbling foundation. His health deteriorated alongside hers. Chest pains, dizzy spells, and doctors' warnings became part of daily life. He endured, holding on for her sake, but when she finally passed, something in him cracked irreparably. As extended family members prepared for the funeral, the household seemed wrapped in a suffocating tension. Cousins, uncles, and distant relatives arrived, some genuinely mourning, others circling like vultures around the millionaire's wealth and inheritance. Old resentments and jealousies simmered beneath their polite condolences. Some whispered about the son's lifestyle, others speculated about how much the widow's estate would add to his empire. The father sensed this greed around him, his sharp eyes catching the false smiles and opportunistic comments. Among the relatives, there were also silent supporters who remembered the family's early struggles and still held respect for the deceased woman's sacrifices. But even they could not deny the air of conflict growing thicker with each passing day. All knew that the son's personal life, particularly his scandalous divorce, had already tarnished the family's image. The mother's death, instead of uniting them, seemed to magnify the cracks. And though no one yet spoke of it openly, there was an unspoken awareness that her funeral would not pass without confrontation. Something lay beneath the surface, hidden truths, secrets long buried, that would rise at the worst possible moment. For the elderly father, grief mingled with dread. He clutched a folded paper in his pocket, its presence like a stone pressing against his heart. He had delayed opening it, telling himself the funeral was not the place, but deep inside, he knew the truth inside those pages was inevitable. And once revealed, it would change the family's story forever. It began like a story people loved to romanticize. The wealthy young man, already building his empire, meeting a woman who seemed to ground him. She was not born into wealth, but she carried herself with dignity and quiet strength. They met at a charity gala where she volunteered, and he, used to women drawn to his money, was surprised by her indifference to his status. She looked him in the eye, spoke plainly, and made him laugh at a time when his life was increasingly surrounded by sycophants. Their courtship moved swiftly, dinners in expensive restaurants balanced with walks in quiet parks where they spoke about dreams and family. To many, she seemed to be the perfect partner to soften his rougher edges, and for a time, she was. The wedding was the kind that made headlines. A grand hall decorated with chandeliers, tables overflowing with food and champagne, a guest list that included business moguls, politicians, and celebrities. Photographers documented every detail, from the bride's shimmering gown to the groom's proud smile. It was a display of power and wealth, but beneath the surface, there was genuine affection. The millionaire's mother glowed with happiness, certain her son had found stability, while the father remained cautious, watching the grandeur with unease. He wondered if this much spectacle could ever translate into a marriage built on simple truths. In the early years, the couple seemed unstoppable. They traveled, built homes together, and appeared at public events as the perfect power pair. She supported his ventures quietly, standing beside him at ceremonies but never demanding the spotlight. To outsiders, theirs was a union made for envy. Yet inside the walls of their mansion, cracks began to show. He was consumed by his business, obsessed with expanding his fortune, often gone for days or returning late into the night. She longed for connection, for shared meals and simple conversations, while he dismissed her concerns as complaints. Arguments grew sharper, no longer about small misunderstandings but about values and trust. She accused him of neglect, of allowing money to define their lives. He countered with accusations of ingratitude, reminding her of the life she enjoyed because of his hard work. The warmth that once bound them began to chill into silence, broken only by public appearances where they forced smiles for cameras. Rumors began to swirl, allegations of his affairs with women drawn to his wealth, whispers of her seeking comfort in friendships he disapproved of. The media fed on every hint of discord, and what was once admired as a fairy tale marriage became fodder for gossip columns. His mother tried to intervene, urging patience and forgiveness, but her words could not mend wounds that had grown too deep. The father, more stern, told his son bluntly that money could not buy loyalty or respect. The son, proud and stubborn, ignored the advice. The final break came suddenly, with lawyers involved and papers signed behind closed doors. The divorce was bitter, public, and humiliating for both sides. Assets were divided, reputations stained, and family members forced to choose sides in a battle no one wanted. For the millionaire, it was another conquest to be managed, but for his ex-wife, it was a scar she carried in silence. She disappeared from the public eye, retreating into a quieter life that left people wondering where she had gone and whether she would ever resurface. No one expected her return, and certainly not at his mother's funeral, carrying within her the undeniable evidence of a new chapter: pregnancy. The past they thought was buried was about to be unearthed before all eyes, and whatever peace remained in the fractured family was poised to shatter once more. The murmurs began the moment she stepped through the doorway, her black dress clinging to her frame in a way that could not hide the undeniable truth. She was pregnant. The air inside the funeral hall shifted instantly, sorrow colliding with shock as relatives and guests turned their heads, some whispering openly, others covering their mouths in disbelief. She had been gone for months, retreating from the glittering world she once shared with the millionaire, leaving behind only questions and speculation. No one expected her to return, least of all to a place as solemn and raw as this, the funeral of the woman who once called her daughter-in-law. Her entrance was deliberate, each step slow, almost defiant, her eyes fixed forward as though she refused to acknowledge the storm she was creating. One hand rested protectively over her swollen belly, a gesture that silenced even those who might have dared to confront her. The significance of her condition was impossible to ignore. Whispers slithered through the rows like smoke. Whose child was it? Why had she come now? Some believed it was the millionaire's, a rekindling hidden from the public eye. Others hissed rumors that it belonged to another man, that she had returned to stir scandal on the very day grief had gathered them all. The millionaire's gaze locked on her the instant she appeared. His expression hardened, jaw tight, eyes filled with a storm of emotions, anger, confusion, and something dangerously close to longing. He hadn't seen her in months, hadn't expected to, and the sight of her pregnant set off 1,000 unspoken questions. Was it his child? Why hadn't she told him? Why here, why now? The tension between them sparked like fire in a dry forest, visible to every guest watching. The elderly father, already frail with grief, shifted uncomfortably at the sight. His knuckles whitened around the head of his cane as his heart thudded heavily in his chest. The woman had once called him father with genuine warmth, had once sat at his dinner table laughing alongside his late wife. Now, seeing her return carrying another life within her, he was torn between anger at the disgrace and a pang of something softer. What if the child truly was his grandchild? The conflict etched itself into his weary face, a struggle between resentment and yearning for continuity of the bloodline. Relatives began exchanging sharp glances. An aunt leaned close to a cousin, whispering about how inappropriate it was for her to show herself here, of all places. A family friend muttered that the deceased mother would never have wanted such a spectacle at her own funeral. Yet others, particularly those who had admired the woman's resilience during her marriage, softened their expressions, murmuring that perhaps grief had drawn her back, perhaps she sought closure. She ignored them all. As she reached the front, her eyes flickered to the casket where the woman who had once been both her fiercest critic and her closest confidant now lay at rest. For a moment, her defiance broke. Her face softened, lips trembling as though she might cry, and she lowered her head in a silent farewell. The room seemed to hold its breath, unsure whether to pity her or condemn her. But the weight of her presence was more than emotional. It was symbolic, a reminder of broken vows, unfinished stories, and unresolved truths. Her pregnancy wasn't just a scandalous revelation, it was a question mark, dangling in the middle of a family already on the verge of fracture. Was this child the heir to the fortune? Was it the link that might bind her back into the family she had left behind? Or was it the final nail in a coffin already filled with secrets and bitterness? The millionaire sat frozen, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned pale. He wanted to confront her, demand answers, but the funeral setting bound him in silence. His father's labored breathing beside him only heightened the tension. Everyone could sense it, that this appearance was not an accident, that she carried with her something more than grief. The funeral, meant to honor the dead, was fast becoming the stage for the living to clash. And in the father's pocket, the folded paper seemed heavier than ever, as if waiting for this precise moment to unleash its devastating truth. The elderly father sat at the edge of the front row, his posture hunched, his cane resting against his knee, his body betraying the years of labor, grief, and quiet endurance that had defined his life. The death of his wife had hollowed him out in a way no one around him fully understood. To outsiders, he was the stoic widower, enduring the loss with a stern face, but inside, he was crumbling. For decades she had been the one to balance him, her gentleness tempering his strictness, her wisdom guiding his stubborn pride. Now she was gone, and the silence left in her absence was deafening. Even surrounded by relatives and friends, he felt utterly alone. He tried to focus on the priest's words, on the prayers rising in the hall, but his gaze kept drifting to the casket, where the woman he had loved for more than half a century lay still and unreachable. Memories flooded him without mercy. The first time he saw her smile, the sacrifices they had made together to raise their son, the countless evenings spent around the dinner table. Each image pressed on his chest like a weight. His heart, already fragile, beat unevenly as he swallowed against the ache rising in his throat. And then, like a wound reopening, his eyes caught sight of her, the ex-wife, the woman his son had divorced. He had not seen her since the separation, and the sight of her now, visibly pregnant, ignited a storm of emotions within him. His first reaction was shock, followed swiftly by anger. How dare she appear here, today of all days? His wife's funeral should have been about dignity, about honoring her memory, not about reopening old scandals. Yet as he continued to stare, another thought gnawed at him. What if the child she carried was his grandchild? This thought tormented him. His son had many flaws, but he was still his only son, the last of the bloodline he and his wife had sacrificed everything to nurture. If the child was his, then that unborn life carried forward everything they had built, every struggle, every victory. He wanted to despise the woman for returning, but he could not stop the flicker of hope that this child might one day call him grandfather. It was a cruel tug-of-war between pride and yearning, between judgment and the simple human desire for family continuity. The relatives around him whispered openly, some condemning her, others smirking at the chaos her presence caused. He felt their eyes dart toward him, waiting to see how he would react. He gripped his cane harder, his knuckles pale, forcing himself to remain composed. His doctor's warnings echoed in his head, too much stress, too much emotion, and your heart won't withstand it. Yet how could he avoid stress when his family seemed determined to destroy itself in public? As the ceremony dragged on, his gaze shifted to his son. The millionaire sat stiffly, eyes narrowed, fists clenched, a storm brewing inside him. The father saw in his son not only anger but confusion, fear, and perhaps even guilt. He wondered if his son already knew the truth about the pregnancy, or if he was just as blindsided as everyone else. Either way, the silence between them spoke volumes, a silence that threatened to erupt at any moment. Deep in his coat pocket, the folded paper seemed to burn against his chest. He had not yet read it, but he knew enough to fear what it contained. He sensed it would force him to confront truths he had long suspected but never voiced. And the thought of opening it here, on this day, filled him with dread. His wife's memory deserved peace, yet destiny seemed determined to deny it. As he lowered his head, weary eyes glistening, he whispered inwardly to her spirit, asking for strength. He would need it for what was coming. The folded paper had been in the elderly father's possession since the day before the funeral, handed to him by a trusted lawyer who insisted it was urgent. At first, he wanted nothing to do with it. His wife had just passed, and his heart was too heavy to bear another burden. But the lawyer's words lingered in his ears. "Sir, this document cannot wait. It concerns your family's future." So he had slipped it into his coat pocket, promising himself he would read it after the funeral, when his grief was not so raw. Yet as he sat in the hall, surrounded by whispers and stares, watching his pregnant former daughter-in-law settle in a pew as if she still belonged, the paper's weight grew unbearable. It was as though it called to him, demanding to be opened now, in front of the very people it would affect most. With trembling hands, he pulled it from his pocket. The movement did not go unnoticed. A cousin leaned closer, eyebrows raised, curious. His son's sharp gaze darted toward him, questioning. Even the ex-wife, her hand resting on her belly, seemed to notice, her expression tightening as though she knew what he held. Slowly, painfully, he unfolded it, the crisp sound of the paper slicing through the hush of the ceremony. His chest tightened, his breath grew shallow, but he pressed on, scanning the words with eyes blurred by age and grief. The letter was not long, but every line struck like a hammer. It was his wife's handwriting. She had written it weeks before her death, a confession of truths she had kept hidden, truths she could no longer take with her to the grave. The first lines spoke of love, of gratitude for the years they had shared, of regret that she would leave him behind so soon. But then the tone shifted, and with it, his world. She admitted to secrets surrounding their son's marriage, revelations she had discovered but kept silent about, hoping time would heal what it could not. She confessed that she had known about the child his ex-wife now carried, that the child was indeed his son's, conceived during a brief reconciliation after the divorce but hidden out of fear of public humiliation. The father's breath caught. He read on, his hands trembling more violently. His wife revealed her fear that greed and pride would consume their family after her death. She wrote about relatives circling like vultures, about the risk of fortune overshadowing love, about the pain of watching her son become a man who measured everything in money and victories rather than compassion. She pleaded with her husband to protect the unborn child, to ensure that their bloodline and legacy would not be destroyed by bitterness and greed. But the letter held even more. It detailed changes she had made to her will, shifting certain assets away from distant relatives and business associates, leaving a significant portion directly in trust for the unborn child. She wrote that this child, innocent and untainted by the mistakes of adults, deserved to be safeguarded above all. The elderly father felt the room spin as the words cut deeper. This paper was not just a letter, it was also a legal document, signed and witnessed, binding in every sense. The son noticed his father's paling face, the way his hands shook as he clutched the pages. "What is it?" he whispered urgently, leaning closer, his voice low but filled with alarm. The father couldn't answer. He felt the eyes of the entire room on him as relatives strained to see, whispers rising again. A few bold cousins craned their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the paper. The ex-wife, her face pale but resolute, stared directly at him, as though daring him to reveal the truth then and there. He wanted to fold it back, to keep it hidden, but his wife's words seemed to echo from the grave. "Do not let this secret destroy what I tried to protect. The truth must be known." His lips trembled as he began to read parts of it aloud, his voice cracking under the weight. Gasps erupted when he mentioned the unborn child, the trust, the inheritance. Relatives erupted into murmurs, some outraged, others stunned into silence. The son's face drained of color, his eyes darting between his father, his ex-wife, and the swelling curve of her stomach. The elderly father's chest constricted, pain shooting down his arm. He gripped his cane tightly, trying to steady himself, but his body betrayed him. The enormity of what he had read, the shock it unleashed, and the emotions he had bottled up for weeks all collided in a devastating blow. The paper slipped from his hand, fluttering to the floor as he gasped for air. Someone screamed his name, chairs scraped against the floor, and chaos erupted in the hall. As he collapsed, the paper lay exposed on the ground, its words clear for anyone bold enough to pick it up. It was no longer a private letter, it was a bomb that had exploded at the center of a grieving family, leaving no one untouched. The moment the elderly father's body gave way, the funeral hall transformed from somber to chaotic. He crumpled sideways in his seat, his cane clattering loudly against the floor, echoing like a gunshot through the silence. The folded paper slipped from his trembling hands and drifted onto the aisle, its presence as damning as the truth it carried. Gasps tore through the crowd, and then came the screams, first from relatives in the front row, then from guests further back, their panic spreading like fire in a dry field. The millionaire son lunged forward, catching his father's frail body before it struck the ground completely. "Father! Stay with me!" he shouted, his polished composure shattering in an instant. His voice was raw, desperate, stripped of the arrogance that usually coated his words. He shook the old man gently, terrified by the lifeless weight in his arms. The priest stopped mid-prayer, stunned, while ushers rushed toward the scene, unsure whether to call for an ambulance or to shield the scandal from prying eyes. The pregnant ex-wife froze where she stood, her face pale, her eyes locked on the fallen patriarch. For all the bitterness that had divided them, a pang of guilt gripped her heart. She had not asked for this spectacle, yet her very presence had been the spark that set the funeral ablaze. Relatives shot daggers at her with their eyes, accusations unspoken but piercing all the same. Some hissed under their breath that she had killed him with her audacity, that her reappearance and the revelation of the paper had been too much for his fragile heart. Cousins rushed forward, some kneeling at the father's side, others snatching at the paper from the floor. One aunt clutched her chest dramatically, whispering prayers, while another relative demanded someone call emergency services immediately. The sound of sirens was still distant in imagination, but the tension inside the hall had already reached unbearable heights. The son pressed his hand against his father's chest, as though sheer willpower could steady the faltering heartbeat beneath. His own tears blurred his vision, falling onto the old man's wrinkled face. "Please not now," he whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking. For the first time, his wealth, his power, his empire, all of it meant nothing. He was just a son, begging not to lose the only parent he had left. All the while, the paper continued to pass from hand to hand, whispers swelling into shouts. Some relatives argued openly about what it meant, others demanded silence out of respect for the dying man. Yet respect was gone, scandal and greed had taken its place. And in the center of it all, the father lay motionless, the chaos around him rising like a storm, threatening to consume the entire family before the night was over. The funeral hall, once a place of mourning, had become a battlefield of emotions. As paramedics rushed in, pushing through the sea of black-clad guests, the atmosphere buzzed with hysteria. Some relatives cried openly, others argued bitterly, their voices rising above the prayers and sobs. The elderly father was lifted onto a stretcher, an oxygen mask pressed against his face, his hand still limp by his side. The son followed closely, his usually commanding presence reduced to that of a terrified child, clutching his father's frail hand as though afraid to let go. But even as the paramedics carried him away, the chaos was far from over. The paper, his wife's letter, her confession, her will, had already ignited a firestorm. Relatives clutched at copies hastily made on cell phone cameras, their eyes glittering with greed or outrage. One cousin shouted that the inheritance was a disgrace, that a child not yet born should not be favored over blood relatives who had stood by the family for years. Another snapped back that the deceased mother had the right to protect her grandchild above all. Voices overlapped, insults flew, and the sanctity of the funeral collapsed under the weight of greed and scandal. The ex-wife stood apart, her back straight though her eyes glistened with tears. She hadn't planned for this moment. She had come to pay her respects, to whisper a farewell to the woman who had once treated her as both daughter and rival. But now she was at the center of every whisper, every accusation. Guests glared at her swollen belly as though it were a weapon, some calling her manipulative, others whispering that she had returned for money, not grief. Yet a small cluster of mourners, those who had truly known the deceased mother, looked at her with compassion. They remembered the bond the two women had once shared, the long talks in the kitchen, the way the mother had defended her even when the son's pride turned cruel. For them, her presence made sense, even if the timing was unbearable. The millionaire son, torn between his father's fragile state and the storm of whispers surrounding his ex-wife, found himself drowning. His empire, built on control and calculation, offered him no tools for this. He wanted to rage at her, demand answers about the child, but the sight of his father fighting for life silenced him. Instead, he stood rooted, his chest heaving, caught between past mistakes and the possibility of a future he hadn't expected. If the child truly was his, then everything, his fortune, his name, his legacy, was about to shift. Meanwhile, the extended family fractured openly. Some demanded legal action, claiming the letter was a forgery. Others whispered about contesting the will, about dragging the pregnant woman into court to prove paternity before any trust could be honored. The greed was naked now, unashamed, spilling out over the pews where moments earlier prayers had been whispered. The funeral had become less about honoring the dead and more about fighting over what the dead had left behind. As the hearse prepared to take the mother to her final resting place, the scene felt wrong. The woman who had lived her life holding her family together was being laid to rest amid division and bitterness. Her last act, meant to protect the innocent child, had instead exposed the ugliness of those left behind. The guests followed the casket in silence, but it was not the silence of reverence. It was the silence of suspicion, of schemes forming, of secrets pressing harder against the surface. The ex-wife walked alone, her hand cradling her stomach, her face unreadable. The son walked behind her, his mind racing, his father's collapse etched into his memory. He could not escape the truth now. The child she carried tied them together in ways that divorce could not sever. And somewhere in the distance, inside a sterile hospital room, his father hovered between life and death, his wife's final words echoing in his mind: "Protect the child. Protect the family." Whether he would succeed or fail remained a question that weighed heavily on everyone's hearts. When the dust of the funeral finally settled, the echoes of that day lingered in every heart that had been present. What was meant to be a solemn farewell became a mirror, reflecting the frailty of human pride and the poison of greed. The elderly father's collapse reminded everyone that life could vanish in an instant, no matter how much money or status one possessed. His weakness was not just of the body, but of the heart, shattered by the weight of secrets, by the fear that his family's legacy would crumble under the weight of their own choices. The paper, with its carefully written lines, carried more than legal terms. It carried a message from a woman who had lived her life believing in unity, sacrifice, and the importance of protecting innocence. Her decision to entrust a fortune to a child not yet born was not about wealth but about hope, hope that perhaps a new life could restore what years of pride and bitterness had destroyed. It was a reminder that family is not just about bloodlines or inheritance, but about love, responsibility, and the courage to put others before oneself. For the son, the lesson cut deepest. He had built an empire on ambition and control, yet he realized, kneeling beside his father's fragile body, that power meant nothing without the bonds of family. His arrogance, his stubbornness, his failure to protect his marriage, all of it had led to this public unraveling. And now, with a child on the way, he was confronted with a choice: repeat the mistakes of the past, or finally honor the values his mother had lived by. For the ex-wife, too, the moment carried weight. She had been judged, condemned, whispered about, yet she had walked into that funeral not for money but for closure. Her tears at the casket proved that grief can coexist with resentment, that love and loss often blur into one another. Her pregnancy was no longer just about her. It had become the axis upon which the future of an entire family turned. And for those who whispered, who fought, who revealed their greed in the shadow of death, the funeral left a scar that would never heal. They had exposed themselves for what they truly were, proving that death does not always bring dignity. It can unmask the ugliest parts of the living. In the end, the mother's words rang true: pride destroys, but love endures. Her final act had forced her family to face their flaws and confront the truth. Whether they chose to rise above or sink deeper into bitterness would decide the legacy she left behind. And as the child grew within its mother's womb, it carried not only blood but the fragile hope that even broken families can find redemption, if only they are willing to learn from the past.